the philosopher who really put the finishing touches to this man-centeredness in thinking was the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who died around 1810. And Pope Pius X, Saint Pius X, who died in 1914, who was Pope from 1903 to 1914, said Kantism is the modern heresy. In other words, the problem with modern people's minds, modern Catholics' minds, is that they're infected with Kant. In other words, Catholics, instead of thinking like St. Thomas, that reality is the king of my mind, they're thinking like Kant, my mind is the king of reality.
So taking to, let's say, its logical conclusion, a modern philosopher, if, let's say, he thought that he was King Henry, then that would be the reality, because he thinks that is so.
Yes. Now, of course, modern philosophers are not quite as dumb as that. They're selective where they are crazy. I mean, they choose where to be crazy and where not to be crazy. When it comes to recognizing whether coffee is coffee on the breakfast table, they recognize that coffee is coffee, because if they didn't, they'd get thirsty. They recognize bread is bread, they recognize the car is the car, otherwise they wouldn't get to the office. But then when they get to their philosophy office or their study and get into their study, then they deliberately choose not to recognize the reality of God, the reality of Jesus Christ, the reality of the Catholic Church. Then in their philosophy study, they set up some crazy system. Then when they've done their day's work, they get back into their car and they recognize that the car is the car. They recognize that the stick shift is not the brake and the brake is not the stick shift. In other words, they recognize reality enough to drive home, enough to perhaps love their wife, enough to etc., etc. In other words, whenever they're leading their normal lives, they recognize reality. But whenever they're setting up their systems, they deny reality. They choose when to and when not to submit to reality. But in their essential thinking, they're setting themselves up as the kings of reality.